I'll just take a moment. Yes. I'll just take a moment to cover a couple things. It's not really an announcement, although there is one. The Lake Provincial Council Executive Committee will be having their spring meeting in Boise on the 13th of May, which happens to be, I believe, the first of the visions of the Blessed Virgin Mary in 1917. But anyway, we'll be having a meeting that day. That night, we'll be having a gathering at our home, Bonnie and Mai's home, and so you'll be invited. More details to come later, but it will be before the chapter. So I want them to get to know our chapter, at least just have a fun time and gathering. So y'all will be welcome, but more information will follow. Also, I've been reading a book, talk about, Satanism and whatnot. I've been reading St. Augustine's City of God. And at the time that, you're familiar with this, at the time that Rome was being invaded in the 4th century, and 5th century, particularly the 5th century, he was writing because the Christians were being blamed for the invasion and the destruction of Rome and the economic collapse of Rome. Of course, that's kind of a little silly when we're looking at, 2,000 years later, 1,500 years later, looking back at the causes of the fall of Rome, but they were being seriously blamed for the fall of Rome and the invasion of the Germans, that were taking over, and Alaric, who was sacking Rome and the churches and everything. And he was basically writing, saying that in all of human history, that the gods of Rome were demons, and that they had praised to them and celebrated them, and they were nothing more than demons, and they never protected Rome from the tragedy of war, never created a virtue or anything, aided nothing towards them. And what they did was increase, lust and deprivation and all this that went on. And it's so interesting because I believe we are viewing it in light of Deacon Bernie's comments with regard to the Satanic Club, etc., is that what we're seeing now is the replacement of God from his throne with different types of gods, of joy, of fun, of deprivation, of depravity, more accurately, and lust and all the other things that encourage mankind, and that we can get away with it. So there truly is nothing new under the sun, literally nothing new. Because the same things that motivated men and women 2,000 years ago, at the time of Cicero, Julius Caesar, at the time of Christ, nothing has changed. These same motivations of worldliness, of the flesh, of lust, of goods and wealth, drive us to the same thing. So it's important that's why historical writings are so important to touch base with them. Because the same thing that motivated past kings and queens and saints motivate us today. Josh?
Yeah, in a small defense, I would say there is a logical connection, you could say, between the notion of a Pax Deorum and the Pax Romanus. When you destroy the peace of the gods, you can destroy the peace of the civilization over which those gods rule, in a sense.
So what was the first one you were saying?
The Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. When you
Yeah.
destroy the peace of the gods, you destroy the peace of the civilization, the government, the Pax Romanus, peace of Rome.
Yeah.
So that, I think, the problem, of course, is that the gods, they weren't gods, but the logical connection there, I think, does follow.
Well, it is, and this kind of, make an interesting presentation, but the Pax Deorum was probably built upon the hardiness of Rome and the natural virtue of Rome, because they had a very strong natural virtue. They said that one of the kings just before the Pyrrhic Wars snuck into the camps of the Romans and recognized their dutifulness towards their soldiers and how, not rigid, but strong discipline that they were, and that they were a mighty army, and that the men were good, and that they could tell that the duty towards each other. And this is actually a writing by one of the kings, one of the Greek kings that had not quite snuck into the camps, but had observed them from the night before war. So that's what would be my argument. But we are living in what we call the Pax Americana. It's really not much of a pax, but it is in collapse. So we have to recognize that. That's part of the recognition of the life we're living. And also recognizing what Bernie is talking about as well. Anyway, that's kind of what, there's a lot going on in everybody's life, so I hope everything goes well.
Is it Jonathan Kuhn has written some books, Harbinger, and his newest one is Return of the Gods.
Yes.
And he's his theory is that since the United States has turned away from God and has kicked God out of all public areas, that it's like when the 7 demons were thrown out, and then when they come back, it's worse than ever. And so he says all the demons are coming back. So that's what we're experiencing now. And he was talking specifically about this latest shooting, that this person, her mind was so confused and stuff. And he said that's what's happening, is all these gods are attacking people and they have no recourse. They don't know.
They don't know what's going on.
In effect, they destroyed the Pax Eorum, and the result is the destruction of the Pax Romana.
Yeah.
It's the same overall argument, and because there's a truth to it.
Well, one point, the point that you're making is very good, because what's happening is the collapse of social peace is directly due to the collapse of the nature, because as people descend into sin, there's no rescue. And the church has become, it's like a self-inflicted wound. It's like, boom, they don't reach out anymore to teach the truth. It's like everybody wants to get along and be happy with each other, as the quagmire of sickness and psychoticness just sinks and people are dying, literally mentally and literally physically, because of the issues of
To add to that, also a reminder that with great evil comes great grace, so that we need to pray and tap into it and act on it, because I think the hardest thing is that we are at rest, and it's so hard to move, get something moving, get something going towards any, what I mean? I feel like it's not just, it's a self-inflicted wound, it's an object at rest tends to stay at rest, and we are at rest. We're not moving. And we're allowing the enemy to create the culture. We have abdicated our duty. This is something that's been on my mind at least a week. We have abdicated our duty, and we are not creating culture of our own. We're allowing them, and then we complain about it and do nothing. And so I really think that one of the things currently we need to do is invest and create culture and do things that at least in pockets can survive.
This is one of the reasons why I've opposed personally and publicly opposed social activism. It's because go take care of your family, raise them up, make them peaceable, responsible adults, make them contribute to society, adorned with the faith, and live. That's what will bring peace.
Agreed.
We have a whole class of Catholics and Christians now engaged in social activism, thinking this is going to change the world towards Christ. It will destroy it. It will destroy it. So where do we go? And maybe this is something we should explore.
I think.
What do we do to turn that around? What's the platform on which I say to the world, I'm done. You can't do this. You can't kill kids and call it a right.
I think that perspective is the wrong perspective.
The what?
We don't say it to the world.
Yeah.
We go underneath the world, just like John Paul II took the young people into the camp areas and taught them in secret.
Yes.
you
And
build
changed his
culture, and the person who affected him had a rosary group with 10 men.
Yes.
It changed the world. Like, you don't tell the world anything. They don't care what we have to say.
Okay, very good answer.
And I think that's the problem. It's like, we just want to scream into the ether, and we're exhausted.
And it's exhausting.
We exist as a chapter for the very purpose that you are describing, that of building a culture. So
Right.
we're building a tiny incubation of a culture here.
Correct.
And that's
And so,
why
like,
we
a
exist.
meeting is a part of our culture.
Right.
Like, this is our culture. And then once we realize these things, like, that's when we can invest more in those things. Like when I was talking to you guys earlier about the homeschool prom last night, and the culture of that prom, that was just like, I'm so proud and happy that we have that. You know what I mean? Like, it makes my heart so happy that that's available to my children because of what Bernie was saying, that what's really being brought
Because
forth, you know what I mean?
your son is being taught how to treat a woman, a
Yes.
young woman.
Yes.
Your young man is being, and this is an incredibly valuable, because men are not naturally developed. They have to be brought up to be men and led to be men. Women, I don't know, but I do know about being a man.
It reminds me of the reading in chapter 1, where talking about Francis Bacon and others who were founding sort of the modern mind.
Right.
And the idea is that technology is going to fix everything and that we can, change. And
Progress.
he compared it to the Lord of the Rings. And he said, we have become Sauron, and our joy is creating the One Ring to control it all. And I just thought that was so beautiful, because it's just like, that's
Well, it's likely not
that's
an
the way,
accident
that's the way
that,
most people are like, oh, let's fix it. We can use science. We can fix things.
well, it's not an accident, I think, that J.R.R. Tolkien used that
Yeah.
as that comparison. I mean, it's very clear. We've become that society. Anyway, those are just some thoughts. I think it's a wonderful discussion. It would be wonderful to have a group discussion some point, that maybe at a chapter meeting or somewhere, and just kind of explore the venues by which we can then change our world and make it a better place. And how do we respond to this? And there's so much more that we want to go into. Anyway, just a couple things.
Just real quick, April said we also see the pattern through all of Scripture that those suffer the most from our movements away from God hurts our children the most. Child sacrifice, for example, Old Testament.
Who suffers the most because of the move away from protecting children? 2 years ago, is children in the womb, and the nonsense that somebody has a right to kill a kid. It's just absolutely utter mental nonsense, but we've accepted it, and this insanity is now permeating all of society. That's what we're seeing. Anyway, great comment, April. Thank you. Anything else?
Yeah, the book called, it's a business book, but thank you. So it's called Good to Great by Jim Collins. Right, so he used an analogy in there of the culture of a business or any organization. It's like a flywheel. It takes a lot of energy to get it going. It goes and it goes and it goes. But after it gets going, it doesn't really take much to keep it going, right? And I really think about that in terms of our culture, that we've stopped, pushing, right? And so people as the church is kind of hollowed out, let's say the Protestant church is kind of hollowed out and stuff, but it was still spinning, right? It's still spinning, and people they weren't going to church, but they were kind of, maybe in their belief, but in the culture, some of the tenets still kind of flow through the culture, but as it's slowed down a lot, right? And I think to get it going again is going to take a huge effort. It's no one person's going to do it. I don't think it would have to be multifaceted and small from the ground up. Whether it's how you raise your kids, I think it's probably the most important one, right? But it's small things at home, but also the Jordan Peterson's talking about the benefits of confession, right? I mean, those types of things. And he's not a Catholic, right? But those types of things, and those people, and everybody has their place. But it definitely is going to take. I don't think it's going to be overnight. I mean, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's not going to be overnight.
But we have to have, okay, so in
Thank you for.
Like, okay, so as an analogy, because I don't think that the Chinese have faith per se, but they have faith in their idea that if they're patient and consistent, that they will win. And they are winning in their consistency and their patience and their infiltration and
Well, that is their ancient culture.
and so what we right now are not acting as if we have faith in in like being persistent, and it's like if we don't, like there's this lie that we believe that if we don't affect all of the people immediately, then it's not worth doing. That is a lie, and that is why we are where we are right now, because we don't believe that God's grace will work.
Right, and with Saint Teresa that said, you don't need to do great things, just need to do
Little things,
little
with
things with great love.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, part of the
Yep.
transformation of civilization. I just brought up the city of God because you can see in his writings the foundation of Western civilization. It's absolutely fascinating. So he's writing in the year 400, and you can see the efforts of building up Christian civilization that popped up in the next 300 years.
Yeah, I think it was April you mentioned earlier, talking about it's very similar. You see that what you were talking about is that concept that when Israel turns from the Lord, it is Israel who suffers. And that's a repeated thing. And this is really the same
It's the
sort of
same thing over again.
Yeah, only with the case of Israel, it's actually the Lord as opposed to
Yeah.
a group of a bunch of gods. But it's the same concept.
Yeah.
And so there is very much a connection between the notion of the Pax Eorum and Pax Romana, or the good of Israel and Israel keeping with the Lord.
And it's just one story after another in the scriptures about the fall, the rise, the fall, the rise. Anyway, thank you for listening. Let's take it's 12 after 11, and let's take a 20-minute break, and everybody grab lunch. And
Was there two of them? Was there two?
yeah, there's two. Four.
They were asking questions about the YouTube channel.
Oh, our YouTube channel? It's St. Margaret of Castello channel. Chapter channel, yeah. It's not well known, we need to get it out there.
Yeah, I should add it to the website.
Huh?
I could add it to the website for us.
Yeah, okay. And we're gonna start doing more, but that depends when. Part of the question, as we get started, this is about St. Margaret of Castello. And unfortunately, I would rather not be up here. I'd rather Anita be up here because she wrote a really beautiful history of St. Margaret of Castello. She did a really good job. And she did this about 14 years ago. Actually, 15. No, 16.
Wow.
There we go.
2007.
October 2006. I just can't count. So 16 and a half. And she's a good writer, and that becomes pretty obvious pretty fast. St. Margaret might help us answer the question that Mike asked earlier, was that to the extent somewhat saying, what is the point of suffering? Why do all of us suffer? And this seems to be an existential question to many people in the secular arena, as well as Christians as well, because when we see senseless suffering, some of the greatest that we see, of course, is in war. And I just find it interesting. As I looked up Brian Chomsky, and he, while you were talking about him,
Noam Chomsky.
and how do you say his name?
Noam.
Noam, yes, Noam, okay.
N-O-A-M, yeah.
Gotta find my notes here for a sec. I got a kick out of him. He says, the only justified war the United States has been in the last, since my lifetime, has been World War II. And I've you know, I've thought about that myself many times. What did I do with my notes? Well, whatever. I wrote them out here on this thing, but I probably picked up the wrong.
How many notebooks do you have?
I got them hanging all over the place.
You can do it.
Oh, I can do it. Okay,
Just wing it.
whatever. I've got her reading right here though. And I find the older I get, the more I believe that to be true. I even hate to say that, but
That you leave notebooks everywhere?
yeah.
Oh.
No. But I believe that the only justified war we've been engaged in the last
okay.
two
Sorry.
generations, a generation being 80 years or 40 years, has been World War II. Why do I say that in light of this? It's because of the nature of suffering that it brings on. And that not just the nature, but suffering that it does bring. Well, there's probably one that is an example of great suffering is St. Margaret of Castello. And this is, by the way, her first-class relic here. And she is... So she, in a very real way, is with us presently. And one of the things, that she was born in the late 1300s. And actually, 1287. She was born in the year 1287, which is the 13th century. And at that period of time, we think of that often as, it's often called the Dark Ages. Many philosophers, and particularly religious ones, calls it the Age of Faith. But if you look at the world at that point in time, it's in pretty bad shape. And we think often of the terror of which we live in today. But just to give you a setting, in 1215, St. John signed Magna Carta. Fourth Lateran Council was assembled. Marco Polo began his trip to China, and the city of Stockholm was founded. Dante was born and began his work. And the Holy Roman Empire was still in effect, and Edward I captured the Stone of Scones, which is the seat upon which Scottish kings were crowned at that point. And this is the world at that time. And the Catholic Church was very powerful, but despite that, there was a lot going on. The Muslims were invading Eastern Europe, and the Crusades had been floundered in that century. And Genghis Khan was building up his power in the Mongol Empire in Eastern Europe and was threatening to attack Europe. Could have really done some serious damage. It only hit the very eastern fringe, and at that point, one of the Khans, the major Khan that was attacking, died. Just happened to die, and it all went away. Thanks be to God, because we may be speaking a different language. At that point, too, one of the things that was going on in Europe that was really threatening a full frontal assault upon Catholicism was the Catholic heresy, what we often identify as Dominicans as the Albigensian heresy, and it was seriously waging a war. And it had basically divided up as if humanity had good and bad natures, flesh being bad and the spirit being good, and therefore if the flesh is bad, then it's okay to engage in all kinds of wrong kinds of things to do, as you can imagine. And it was just it would have destroyed civilization if it had been allowed to continue. And thank God that the men and women of that time understood the danger enough to wage a spiritual and literal physical battle against it, to conquer it. If it had not been conquered, we'd have been in the dredges far more quickly than we do today. And you think also of the great saints of the 13th century. St. Clare of Assisi, St. Francis, St. Albert the Great, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Anthony of Padua, that's my confirmation name, St. Bonaventure, and of course, our Holy Father, St. Dominic, was the founder of the Order of Preachers, and the founding of what we carry tradition today. And I so often hear from people is they had some contact with the Dominicans out, either raised by them or lived near a parish, grew up near Jesuits, but were exposed to the Dominicans and understood that the essential carrying that they do, the carrying the truth, bringing it forward, and exposing people to the right thinking, just like we saw with Peter Kreeft today, and what the impact of dealing with the truth instead of fooling ourselves. We begin to live in this truth. So anyway, in her writing, she sets this up very beautifully. And in 1287, when Margaret was born, she was born into a moderately noble family in a city called Matola in Tiberia, Italy, which was one of the papal states. The papal states would have been in the middle of Italy, from the east coast to the west, and encompassed Rome. It was not southern Italy, and it was not northern Italy. So if you can imagine, it was likely, Matola is likely on the near the east more than the west side. And long story short is when she was born, her parents were terribly embarrassed and felt that it had been a terrible, lack of a better word, curse upon them, and wanted to dispose of her. I mean, I think they would have if they'd understood. But they were mercilessly, as she says, that selfish and merciless, and cruel and devoid of any affection for her. And it was a parish priest at the time, whose name was, God bless him, Father Castello, wanted to have her baptized, and her parents refused to do that. But she was born as a dwarf. One leg was shorter than the other. She was hunchbacked, and that she was completely blind. You know, too often this would invoke the love of a parent and the solicitude and the care of a parent. But it did just the opposite. It filled her parents with disgust, and they reacted accordingly. And they wanted strict secrecy in involving her. And in doing so, as she was raised, this is when she was quite young, they tried to seclude her in the castle where they lived, because they lived in a castle. And of course they had staff. And one day they were having a meeting, and somebody from the public was exposed to her. And they were aghast. Not the guests so much as the parents, that she would be exposed to publicly. And it prompted an outbreak of parental fear, yet lest their secret child would have been completely revealed. And they had her hidden away, and they put her in a tiny cell of a few square feet in a local parish, which would have been on the grounds of the, in those days, not unknown for a parish to be on castle grounds for the family to worship in. And it was about, according to this, about a quarter of a mile away from the castle. And it was rationalized that Margaret might hurt herself wandering through the castle, and that it might be a great privilege for the devout little girl to be able to pray day and night without any hindrance from parents, staff, or whatever. And of course, the mother supported the child, but she was still pretty weak in her protest for putting this child away in a secluded place. One of the things, though, is that she enjoyed daily mass and the sacraments, and confession was available to her constantly by this parish priest. You know, it's fascinating how Father Castello had a real grasp of what was going on in her situation, and she suffered real agonies because, now imagine that, in those days, they didn't have the medicine we have, they didn't have, even as rich as they were, they didn't have the remedies to resolve the situation. So you're living in a small square footage, walled away from the world, outside of a place where you could slide in food. That was her exposure. But the cold and the lack of heat in winter, and the heat and the lack of coolness or breeze in the summer. How many of us have lived in the South or experienced the South or elsewhere where it's very warm, but you can go and seclude yourself in the shade from the heat and from the sun. And that was not something she could do, that she could enjoy. This went on for many, many years. She wept.
Until she was a teen, I think.
Yeah, that went on evidently for 13 years, according to this, yeah. And she wept, notes that she wept bitterly over her torments. But he understood at least, and her trials were pretty consistent. Father William Bonnewell, in his book, The Life of Blessed Margaret of Castello, now saint, puts the following words in the priest's mouth. In other words, in quoting what St. Margaret said. Father, when they brought me here this morning, I did not understand, because of my sins, why God let this happen to me. But now he has made it clear. Jesus was rejected even by his own people, and God is letting me be treated the same so that I can follow our dear Lord more closely. And oh, Father, I am not good enough to be so near to God. And she was so overcome by the thought of God's love for her that she could not continue. So in other words, she accepted in full grasp of the suffering she had to deal with, and with the lot of life that she had been given. It's just one reality that in the lot of life, that what looks at first to be God's cruelty and treatment of us, she became to realize that she needed to endure the pain because it's really a source of God's mercy. What would have happened to little Margaret if she had been physically beautiful? Or still, suppose she had been born a boy, and her father had been allowed the fulfillment of dreams of him becoming a soldier, or taking over his business. She would have been in the obscurity of the ages, just like her parents are with us today. Would she have learned to use real beauty that might lie beneath physical ugliness, or would her parents have imparted to her their own spiritual blindness? We don't know. But the blessing of who she was has come down through the centuries. For it's not her mother and father that we have here with her, but she herself in this suffering that she dealt with. And trying to understand, to come to full grasp that she did, to understand why this was given to her. As, for instance, Job accepted the suffering of God, not the suffering of God, but the reality that God permitted the suffering. We do know that some things that are a lesson to us today that comes down to us. First is the hideousness of ingratitude. Have you ever been around someone that is not thankful for what they've gone through, for the lessons learned, for the punishments that they've been given and endured, and they come back at it again and again and then condemn those? This morning, I got a call. I'll leave it anonymous, but my nephew called, and for the umpteenth time, he got pulled over. He got caught with MJ in the back of his car with his girlfriend, and he starts out and says, "The cops were unjust in doing this." And I go, "You just don't get it, do you? You don't get it. It's not the cops. It's you. You are the problem. When are you going to make up your mind?" Blank, his name. And I was pretty hard on him, and I told him, "I love you, but you've got to face something." And the part of the reality is, God keeps coming back and hammering him against the head, "Wake up," and he refuses to do so. He's going to continue to make the mistakes that his father did, and it just doesn't end. But does it? I don't know. But it's that I asked him to look at it in this way. That thank God that he was again caught. Change the way you're going, or you will go by the way of your own relative. I don't know if it got into him, but it's something. it notes here, there is no good thing that we deserve on our own merit. So gratitude is the greatest thing that we can give God, in addition to worship, that is through the Holy Mass, the holy sacrifice of the Mass. Gratitude helps us more than it helps him. But he does appreciate it for obvious reasons. Because we as parents, as the boss, or as friends, when we give gratitude to them, so much appreciate, when we've gifted something to them. So what would it have been, the gifts that we have today to us as compared to the life of the 13th century? We have modern conveniences. We don't worry about air conditioning. It just is a completely different world. Could we have even lived back then? Really, could we have? I don't know. Life was short, it was nasty, it was cruel. But here was this woman who, even in the normal course of 13th century life, as cruel as it was placed in a far more cruel situation. And she still endured. And thank God for her place. The second lesson, that God's wills all things in our good, and that good is his primary care for our eternal life. I don't know if that makes sense. But in a real way, that is where we're headed. Do we accept that which has been given to us and accept it in a manner that is thankful? That we all complain. I know I do. I can only speak for myself. And sometimes I actually catch myself in the middle of the complaint thinking, wake up. And it's easy for, I have a couple good friends that were prosecutors. And prosecutors can tend to be very cynical. Cynicism is the fruit of experiencing human realities. It's like getting to know somebody too well. Contempt is a natural result of that. That's why men and women are better for each other, because they're different enough so that they get always, through all of life, they discover the differences. There's something new around the corner. And my point is that in this reality that we can begin to be thankful for the differences, be thankful for where we're headed. And it just, instead of lashing out at God or trying to judge others or complain, we then begin, the thankfulness becomes more of a joyful attitude. And it's not the joy of dancing clowns. It's the joy that infects your heart to realize that you can begin to have a difference in the life around you, in those little things. We may suffer cruelly like St. Margaret did, but we cannot know in this life the even greater evils that the suffering averts, not only for ourselves, but for the world. So the suffering that St. Margaret did, as St. Paul says, that the suffering of Christ falls short in some ways. Not anyone really knows completely what this means, but there's been some great theological stabs at understanding it. And maybe St. Margaret opens the door to that a little bit, is that her suffering enables us to see the reflection of Christ in her, in its completeness, and understanding that human cruelty can lead to a blessing. What is the blessing of World War II and the suffering that occurred there? What's the blessing of the 60 million children killed in the womb? What is the attitude, the blessing of the attitude of death that we see about us, the culture of death? I'm still waiting and I'm looking. But I'm thankful to be alive and working towards the end of trying to make sure people do live, and hopefully towards a better life. At some point, Anita did some good work on understating what the world was like back then, and then she compares it to today. And she goes on in this one paragraph. She says it is staggering to meditate on the differences between our time and this time, today, and the 13th century. Amid the holocaust of abortion and the perils of a world war that threatens to dwarf even unspeakable and unprecedented bloodshed of the last 100 years, the wealth, personal freedom, and physical comfort of the 21st century, even in the United States, has never surpassed in human history. Poor people in this country are far better than any other standard in the world, by any measure today and any measure by the 13th century. Ordinary people can traverse the continent, and she goes on and explains the modern technocracy and the ability to travel and communicate in an instant. Our advances in hygiene and climate control allow us to keep ourselves clean without leaving the warmth of our homes, but to create completely germ-free environments. Most of all, the principles of due process and equal protection are enshrined in our Constitution. However imperfectly they may be, they're well noted in the process and procedures whenever we have to face the cruelty of the court system. But at best, the 13th century was nasty, brutish, short, and cheap. And so it's behind that we understand that the cruelty of her parents and those who permitted this, that she staved off the bitterness of life and was able to push on through this. I was trying to think where she does some, the current situation, prisoners, even prisoners of war in time of war, were far better treated than she was, and goes through quite a bit of that. One thing that St. Margaret had that was superior than probably even her parents or many about her was her intelligence. She was very intelligent. She was very capable of seeing and accepting and reasoning through correctly what was going on about her. And that was the amazing thing, that whatever was inflicted upon her, she could willingly accept through the grace of God. But it was also through her accurate reasoning, her clarity of thought. And this extraordinary mind was a gift from God, and it was not given in vain. That's the important point. Her intellect gave her wisdom and understanding, of course, far beyond her years. But that dear Father Capellano gave her the faith, handed on the faith. She's a really good example of why the faith should be taught to children, despite who they are, despite whatever misgivings we have of them, whatever we think. That person looking at you in the face, this little guy or gal or whoever it is, may actually become a saint and stand before the throne of God. And it is through this suffering that she gave way. It was 13 years that she did this, and there were many setbacks, but in spite of the many bitter winters and sweltering summers, the dampness, the filth, the awful smells, the hopeless confinement, and the hatred of her family, Margaret's boundless trust in God preserved her in her peace. That's a known fact. We know this. In her diary, St. Faustina records that Jesus said to her, the more a soul trusts, the more it will receive. Souls that trust boundlessly are a great comfort to me, speaking of Jesus. The speaker is Jesus, because I pour out all the treasures of my graces into them. I rejoice that they ask for much, because it is my desire to give much, very much. And at some point, Margaret understood, and as I've said before, she understood her torments, and they were the source of great grace. She spent 13 years there, as I've said before, at the Church of St. Mary of the Fortress of Mantola. In 1305, an earthquake of political proportions hit the city where she lived and the province of Traberia, and it swept her out of her cell at that point, and she was shortly after that taken to Castello, where there was some legend that miracles were occurring in Castello before this, the tomb of a frau, I forget his name, I can find it here, but they took her there, and she spent quite a bit of time there, and all day, one day, at the behest of her parents to pray for a healing, and it didn't happen. But there was cause. I mean, we have to stop and think, if we had a child like that and we lived the life that they did, we would expect, in a way we can't judge her parents too harshly, because in some ways we're so much like that. At least I can only speak for myself. I can't judge for you, but I can say that we begin to ignore certain realities in life and the presence of God and the pressure of day-to-day life. And that's what took on that reality. Anita goes through quite a bit of the 13th century history, which I've also restated, but will not do more here. But it was the time of the Great Famine, 1317, 1315, just killed millions of people across Central and Eastern Europe. And King Edward III, which was Saint Joan of Arc, was a result of, which commenced the 100 Years' War. Tens of thousands, hundreds of, lots of people were killed during that 116-year war. The Black Plague hit Europe in 1347, literally killed probably 1/2 to 2/3 of the population. And many heresies that arose during that time. So these were the political upsets that caused them to move and move on to out of original town and the
They just dropped her off. and went
Treveria. Huh?
back. They just dropped her off and went back.
Oh, at Castello?
Yeah, they left her.
After that,
In front of,
Right, they waited
Praying.
to see if there'd be a miracle,
And then they just dropped her off.
Looks like no miracle's happening. so-
without saying goodbye.
yeah. And then, of course, they abandoned her. And in a way, you know the rest of the story. But the reality is that after they dropped her off there at Castello, of course, she's named Castello as part of her saint's name to this day. The reality is that at that point, she became eventually involved with as a third order Dominican and wore the habit of a local congregation, and many, many people were blessed. And I've read many stories of her, about her death, where people were raised from the dead and still do. And there are many miracles of healing and that type of thing. I urge anyone, in fact, this is certainly part of the curriculum of formation, is to read this work that was done so well by Anita as a summary of Margaret's life, because the chapter's named after her. She is certainly a pinnacle of example for us on what to do with our own lives and accepting our situations and the suffering we have to deal with it, either be it red suffering or black. In other words, through emotional pain or through actual bloodletting or physical suffering, that type of thing. That how do we deal with that? How do we face it? The reality is that we're all going to eventually walk through this door that God will, depending on who we are, will accept into the next life. I wish Anita was here. I would rather her be here to explain this story for parts of the reason, because she sets this up so well about what the world was like in this time period and what kind of person St. Margaret was and how she lived and how she accepted this suffering in her life. And I think it's really important. It's a good lesson for me that we understand this for ourselves. So maybe somewhere in all that is part of the answer to Michael's question is, what is the point of suffering that he raised, and what is the objective, and why do we all suffer?
It's posted on the website.
Yes. Yeah.
Four parts.
Yeah. It's posted on the website, and it's not a very long, it's a very quick read, but it's probably 2 coffee cups worth. But or 2 beers, but it's a serious take on a life well lived.
And the book, Blessed Margaret of Castello.
Right, it's written by
fantastic.
Bonnewell.
I highly recommend that as well. Especially in that book, the way that the author expressed how she did not speak poorly of her parents, even after she was abandoned. She also tried to join some nuns, a convent in Castello. They kicked her out because she was too virtuous, and then slandered her, and she took that and she was just like, I'm not good enough. You know what like she took everything so gracefully and in our, like, part of the reason why the adoration is named after her is because, like, in the generation of like professional victims, you know what I mean? Like, this is how a real victim of real injustice at every turn of her life responds in grace, right? And it's like, how are we supposed to respond in this culture? Right what I mean? Because it's so easy for us to also be another victim. You know what I mean? It's like, how are we different? How are we going to be different?
I'm laughing because there was something else on social media. I'll explain it in a
Another
minute.
thing in her talk is that when she was in Castello, she began to be taken in by different poor people in their families. A lot of their families were in bad shape. There would be anger, hatred, there would be fighting, there would be all kinds of things that would cause her great hurt that she didn't enjoy. But what happened was that she would stay there and continue to be cheerful and and every place that she stayed was better afterwards.
Right. And they were also blessed. Like, they received God's blessing in many different ways. Like, oh, I love that story. But I really think it's one of the antidotes to the cultural chaos. So,
But she's being hidden. They didn't even do a real, save her in the back and she's being hidden.
I'm not sure if this makes sense, but like, I think about it, like,
it's still blessed, by the way. Sorry, John. Sorry. Go ahead.
no, it's okay. Her suffering all that time in that cell and so on and so forth, and I think about, like, what's the point of it and all that kind of things, but there's some, I hate doing squats. I absolutely hate doing squats.
Leg days.
Leg days are the worst, right? But it's true of any exercises, but you have to go through the suffering to have the growth. There is no growth without suffering. I mean, and so, sometimes maybe the greater the suffering, the greater the growth, right? Would she be such a great saint without such great suffering, right? And then we touched on that. The other thing I think about, I don't want to go back and live in the 13th century. I do not want to go back to live in the 13th century. But I look at, I think today, and I see suffering of a different kind, right? And it's not just, I wouldn't say just spiritual suffering. I think there are definitely professional victims of all sorts. But like, I remember I was listening to a podcast and they said, like, they're talking about the obesity epidemic and diabetes epidemic and da-da-da. And they say, if you were to see human beings in the wild, they would not look like human beings walking through New York right now, right? So we're living, in a toxic food environment, a toxic this environment, in people, that there is real suffering going on, but from people, physical suffering, emotional suffering. I deal with teenagers. They are suffering. It's real. Now again, they're not locked away, in a cell, but in some ways it's worse. They're inside their own heads, and they've been fed this stuff and fed, crap food. It's just they're suffering. And it's real.
Yeah,
but again, I think they misdirect what when they go, oh yeah, I'm suffering, and it's this thing's fault. They're wrong, right? In pointing their fingers, right? But there is definitely, suffering. I would be shocked if 100 or 150 years from now they don't look back and go,
there's real suffering here.
like, look, it's as obvious that when you open your eyes and you see, like, I teach history class, so we're watching, a film from, whatever, 50 years ago, and it shows people walking around New York, and, and they're all pretty fit, right?
And
you look at
psychological suffering.
yeah, psychological, yeah, it goes hand in hand. So I think there's, so comparing, 1300s again, I don't want to go back there, right?
Yeah.
But,
Well, each age has its,
swing by pairs at the right time.
or the wrong time.
each age has its triumphs and its weaknesses. But
He's a pretty smart guy, I wouldn't mind talking to him.
You know, there's a deal on social media. Now, anybody know Michael Knowles? Washington
Yes.
Law? Okay. He's a partner, not a partner, but in business with Ben Shapiro, which probably most of you know. And he was doing this talk at this university, and there's this meme online, like about 1 minute, of him answering a question of this woman who gets up and she says, "I'm so glad to be here, glad that we can, you can speak this, answer questions here at this university that used to be, that belonged to such and such tribe, you know, 100 years ago or 200. Which has, and then she goes on and explains how it's been in their possession from millennia and millennia. And he just responds, no, you guys, he just explains that they conquered each other and they went and they were cruel and they beat each other up and they, you know, I don't want to offend any blooded Indians, but I'm Irish, and the Irish got conquered by the British, and the British got conquered by the Saxons, and, you know, it just goes on and on and on. Then there's this, below this social media was this once meme from a movie. I don't know how long ago, but it looked like probably from the 50s. There's this white guy receiving this complaint from this Indian chief saying, well, we've been here, we kind of sprung from the grass. We've been here forever, and you guys have conquered us. And this guy, no, you never see this movie today. But the reality is that everybody's a victim today. But the white guy says, yeah, it happened to us too. And then he gives the European history how they conquered each other. Yes, we came over and we conquered you. And you know, I've been saying this for a while. Let's deal with the reality as, yes, they've been conquered. We did conquer the Indian, and it was tragic. Accept the truth of the reality. But the same thing happened in England and Ireland, the cruelty of human cruelty. And this guy says, this has been going on from the beginning, and you, sir, are no different. Talking to the Indian chief. And then, part of the answer that Michael Knowles gave is the 80,000 per year that men and women that were killed by the Aztecs. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie, what they did to sacrifice. There's some movies made about it, but they had this huge temple, and this is what Cortez discovered. The reality of human nature was discovered in those temples, the ability to murder. But they lay these people across and pull their hearts out while they're living and still beating, and sacrifice them literally.
Those guys wanted to beat hearts.
And there is a book, the reason why I bring this up is because victimhood is the master of our age presently, but it won't survive because truth always comes out. But there's a book called The Conquest of Mexico by it was written when this pastor was 90 years old, but he had gone with Cortez to Mexico, and he just kept a log. And it's really worth a read. I've loaned mine out to somebody, but it kind of describes to you very precisely what those temples were like and how horrid they were, just blood-laden, thick with human blood. Why is that point is that we're very capable of, so part of the reason why God grants suffering is for us to straighten our lives out and turn back to Him and accept Him and obey Him and live in accordance to His Word. So we don't become victims, and we become, I think what you gave the example is St. Margaret became affirmative in her life. She wasn't going to let these things defeat her. And she suffered, but she didn't stand around with the other gals or guys and complain over a cup of coffee. She got up and she moved on, and she picked up and moved on. She was not a victim, but she really could have been. Truly could have been.
I'm kind of thinking that she must have had some people in her life that enabled her to be the way she was. So I'm imagining that her parents probably had the servants take care of her, and one or more of the servants probably showed her a lot of affection when she was very little. And then when she was walled in the church, the priest must have shown her a lot of time and attention and noticed her mind and started to educate her.
Yeah, there is indication in the book that she was treated with she worked with one of the maidservants. And in fact, the maidservant walked her over to be baptized. Not the mother, not the father, but the maidservant. So there's likely indications from the record that she was treated well. Clearly from the record, the priest loved her up and taught her the faith and catechized her. But even more than that, delivered the sacrifice of the Mass and also probably food and love as well. I think you're right
The
on
book
that.
also said they think that her knowledge of the Psalms, because she was able to pray the office, that was miraculous.
Could be, if she had a very bright mind and she was hearing it every day from the priest, she could also pick it up that way.
Yeah, very
Because
clearly.
remember, she doesn't read, right? So, I don't think there was any Braille back
But-
then.
but
So
I
that
think
means
it's
her
also-
memory would be exercised.
I think she started it when she became a lay. When she started that practice.
Well, yeah, I'm just saying, but back then, all the clergy had to say the office, and here's a girl who is literally living the life of a hermitess, right? When she's very young. That priest, unless he's heartless, is going to try to do all he can with it, right? So, it sounds like he was a good priest, a holy priest.
Yeah,
So,
it was absolutely.
I imagine that he probably did the office in her earshot and explained it to her and all that kind of thing.
Clearly, your point's well made that she was exposed to people of goodwill and also of miraculous intent. I mean, of heroic intent that wanted to help her out and deliver, because they probably saw the spiritual value of who she was.
I heard this attack on Catholics on this show recently, and it was about the 1300s. It was about during the Black Plague, and it's a show about the science of cats. I was watching, and they had an expert on about cats, and she's talking about this, and so she says, well, the reason that the Black Plague was so bad because this Pope during that time, the 1300s, which I think would have been Clement VI, I think maybe. Anyways, he came down on witches and black cats and cats in general. And so there was this wave of people killing cats everywhere. And so because the cats were killed, the rat population expanded and the Black Plague happened. So it's because of the Pope.
It was the larger attack. It was the larger attack on male dominance and patriarchy.
Oh, yeah, that was mentioned too.
I pretty much turned it off after that.
Yeah, whenever those words are brought up, I'm like, I can't even take you seriously.
But it just cracked me up that people believe this stuff, they really do.
Well, you have to realize also that leaders impact society. That the waves of activity occur because of comments from leadership.
I think, and then I want to restate what I said, because I really appreciate what you're saying. That the difference between being a victim and suffering. People can say, so she suffered, but she wasn't a victim.
Well, and it harkens back to that quote from Kreft, however you say his name, with regard to the truth. Many of these people who claim to be victims are no more a victim than any Hollywood star enjoying the benefit of holding their Grammy up. I mean, they're just simply mentally nuts because they're denying the truth. Anything else?
I've been contemplating uniformity with God's will by St. Alphonsus Liguori, particularly about accepting whatever comes as willed by God and for our benefit, right?
For our salvation,
For our
yes.
good, yeah. Having peace at whatever comes, which is a really interesting
Now you
a
have
way
to.
to think about suffering, right?
Yeah.
Things that happen to us. And talks about the farmer that has an amazing crop, right? And he's like, how do you have such a good crop? And the farmer's like, just whatever comes
Is what I get.
is what I get, and just good.
Yes, you have to also recognize that these words are easily said.
Oh yeah. I don't know how to get there.
Well, I feel like that's the
So
word is
fascinating.
teaching,
Yeah.
is that whatever happens is for our salvation. The good is good for our salvation. I'm like, oh, that's a hard one.
Well, it's kind of like the doctor poking around on a woman's stomach and the child inside, what the heck's going on? I'm getting pushed around, bumped around, and I'm having to deal with and get, and if he was comprehending or she was comprehending what's going on there, so doesn't realize that this is part of the passage to get out into life itself. This is probably no less true than for us here. This poking around and the suffering we have to deal with is to bring us and deliver us and birth us into eternal life.
Yeah.
That's really, and part of that, the point that Paul keeps bringing up, is we're already there. We're already birthed into eternal life. It's about us. I mean, at the time of, in Romans 6, he talks about how do we know? It's because we're baptized. He answers that question, by the way, here in Protestants.
Jesus
Is that this is part of the experience. We've already begun the birthing process. But we've still got to deal with the suffering and the reality of things that we deal with. So,
So pray for the lady at her St. Martin.
yes, we'll be praying for her.
I noticed in your description that she had to think out why the evil was happening to her, and she saw it as a participation in the cross of Christ. So that would provide hope, which is necessary for charity, right? Because she sees that these things are working out for her good, and not just an ordinary good, but a kind of extraordinary good in her.
And that maybe that's the difference between what would you call the type of joy that is, what's the name of that girl that they did a movie where it's just kind of Pollyannish.
Well,
Versus-
it was actually biblical based, because she.
The fact that you got that.
I know how we got it.
Well, yeah, don't ruin my point, though. No, I'm kidding. My point is, Pollyannish has a meaning,
Yeah.
right? And I agree, it has some biblical basis. But Pollyannish, on its own, the word is kind of like, it's kind of like imagine empty-headed. I'm happy because I'm happy.
You
There's
don't
no.
see the evil, right? The
Yeah.
Pollyanna is ignoring the evil.
Ignores evil, it ignores the reality of the toughness of life. And what's really bad about evil about Pollyannish is it doesn't recognize your neighbor and your neighbor's needs to resolve, and it doesn't recognize the need for love. That's Pollyannish.
Do you remember one of the stories where she was staying? She was praying, but it caught on fire, like the house caught on fire. Do you remember the story?
I don't.
And so she was praying, and they're like, Margaret, like it's on fire. You need to get out. And she's like, what did she? She threw her cloak on it and yelled something and went back to pray. Like her cloak put out the fire.
Yeah,
I loved it.
that's in the book.
Yes.
Not in here.
Yeah.
And I remember.
And she's blind.
And she's blind. She's like, Psh, I ain't got time for this, I'm praying.
It reminds me of Mother Teresa.
And that's why we're under her mantle.
Mother Teresa arranged to go to Lebanon, and she went to pick up some people that were actually caught in the midst of war in the hospital there. And she ran to a chapel that had adoration. She did a quick novena. It was not a 9-day novena, more like a 9-minute novena.
Mm-hmm.
And they let them out. She rescued these people. As part of that, God help me quickly, I need it. Or the resolution of somebody who's a saint like that, God listens to and opens the doors wide, to let things happen. We see this in Scripture a lot.
I think another point is if you're undergoing suffering, it's very necessary to pray, because suffering is like a temptation. And that in the past I've described Thomas explaining, pray always, pray whenever you're in temptation is the first meaning of that. So if someone is suffering, it's necessary to pray to get the strength to be able to bear the suffering, or to reduce it. I mean, God can take it away too.
Or both, yeah.
Yeah, or it could even increase it and give you even more strength. But the point is you have to ask for that help. And suffering makes it really evident to us that we need to ask because we feel unable to bear it. Right?
No, that your point's well made to extend. In modern world, we have a lot of suffering, claimed suffering that's based upon lies. Like victims of trans haters or this kind of thing, which is all BS. But they're suffering, and the point is that even there the devil is at work. Pushing them to claim they're suffering, that they have to deal with haters and all this other stuff, which is all.
Well, and you have to look what St. James says, right? Because he tells us why our prayers are not answered. And one of the reasons is because we want to spend them on our passions, right? And you can see in the trans movement and stuff like that, all that LGBTQ stuff, that if they do pray, they don't pray as they ought because they're not asking for what they want.
ought to be praying for.
They're not asking for what they ought to have. They're asking for something evil, and God's not going to give them that evil thing.
And Romans 1 says that he actually ignores them if they live in
Well,
certain
then
lifestyles.
he lets them to their
He leaves them
punishment
to their-
is being submerged in their sin. So like to the beginning of what you were talking about
Yeah,
with your nephew, your punishment is your addiction to your sin. God's mercy is being caught by the cops.
right.
And that is so backwards in
Our
most
thinking.
people's thinking,
Yes,
because it's like the punishment is being caught by the cops.
It's absolutely it.
You know what I mean? But
Yeah.
it's really opposite. Our punishment is being left in the mud.
Yeah, the greater punishment.
Right.
The greatest punishment for sin is more sin.
Yes. Which our culture doesn't understand.
well said.
So, yeah, don't sin.
Thank you. The end. Thanks.
Are we ready for Salvo?
Yeah,